said I'll be beginning my speech in 3, 2, 1. Since this debate can easily enter into the realm of example mudslinging, let's just clarify that this debate is not going to be just about example, and it's going to be about what utility we derive and how we make these decisions. So with that being said, what's the framework opening government is going to follow for this debate? We're going to tell you that the best decisions that are made are decisions that are made with you having the ability to comprehend all the variables of the decision best. Those are the kind of decisions that are best made. The second framework for what's the best decision is what certainly derives most utility to you and maximum happiness towards yourself, right? So then, now let's understand what is the framework of what are the arguments in this debate. Firstly, is that most long-term decisions are made on a sense of fear or apprehension. Why is this true, right? So the first reason for this is that most humans have an inertia to go ahead and change the way in which they live, right? So since your natural habitat is the one which you're most comfortable with, and the fear of uncertainty scares you the most, your comfort and familiarity makes you apprehensive to go ahead and consider change, right? Which means that most decisions where you need to consider that something in the long term is going to happen or some eventual change is going to happen are decisions where apprehension, fear, and self-doubt will probably be your first thought. But not just that, right? Why are these long-term decisions that are made by society's influence? Why do we tell you so, right? So, firstly, is that the way in which you make these long-term decisions, the way in which your decision-making calculus works, are governed by things like the media around you, which goes ahead and gives you short summaries of things that are happening around you, by things like your parents, because you think that they are more experienced and they have seen the world more, by things like your school and your university, because that's the kind of place where you gain your education from, and things like your peers and things like narratives, which means that the amount of influence that society has when you're given more time or given the ability to think about your decisions more is significantly higher, which means that what ends up being likely to happen is a lot of people in developing countries go ahead and choose the same career path because of the fact that they are influenced by these media, parental, and societal narratives where they need to go ahead and choose engineering, do JEE, get into the best university, etc. Not a personal story. But then, what is the next thing? What's the next thing that we consider in this debate, right? It means that at the point when your decision-making compass is best, when you are able to get agency or control over the decisions, it means that are the kind of best decisions you make. Why is this true in short-term decisions as opposed to long-term decisions? Firstly, is that when you make a short-term decision, the calculus that you use to make your decision is what you derive most utility from, or what will make you most happy in the long run. What is a simple kind of example for this is that if somebody from the queer community thinks about the repercussions of them coming out, their decision-making compass should be whether I will be kicked out of the house tomorrow if I come out or not. Is it safe for me to come out or not? Not about what will society think of me in the long run. What will my future in my sport look like? What my future in whatever field I want to go look like, right? At the point when they don't consider these things that are not in their control, we feel like they derive most utility from that decision. But even if you consider all that is not true, even if you consider that decision is made with less information, we tell you, irrespective of whether you make a correct or a wrong decision, you're more likely to self-doubt and regret your decision at the point at which you think about long-term decisions. Why is this true? So, firstly, your control over a short-term decision is more because your ability to overthink is lesser, which means that you don't put the same amount of accountability, or you don't put the same amount of emphasis on yourself as to how much of your mental capacity went into making that decision. Why is this more true with long-term decisions? You go into something and say that you have to spend your next 3 years doing it. If you decide that this is going to be your career choice, if you decide that say consulting is going to be your career choice, and you're going to spend 3 years just building your resume for going ahead and getting into consulting, every single time that you fail yourself in building your resume for doing that, every single time you fail at doing that, you're going to regret every moment of that. But not just that, at the point at which you don't have the requisites to get into that career in the first place, at the point at which you probably fail your interview or don't get the shortlist, you're going to regret all the 3 years that you put into the decision making after that. You're going to regret all that, and it's probably going to get much worse after the process too, which means that the regret during the process is higher and the regret after the process is higher. What we proved to you so far is that the utility while making the decisions better and later and making it later too. So then, what is the most important thing here is that you have control over things that can be controlled, right? Which means that your current circumstances, the current information that you have of the things around you are the things that you can control the most. Which means that if you are in a marriage that is probably you're in your 30s and you're in a marriage that probably doesn't make you super happy, it's probably best for you to divorce rather than thinking that 5 to 7 years later I'll probably be too old to go ahead and date anybody else. So let me just be stuck in this marriage and be sad and stressed forever. Close it.
Things like social media trends exist and so many people jump onto it. What do you think sort of decisions are also based on societal narratives as opposed to just
Okay, so the key difference here is that when you are given a long-term decision, when you are given the ability to make a long-term decision, the amount that you need to rely on these narratives increases significantly, because now you need to think of other arbitrary factors that you do not have the knowledge of. When you are making a short-term decision, most of the factors that you need to think of are the factors that you have knowledge of and that are in your control. When you have to make a long-term decision, there are arbitrary things like where will I be in life, which career choice is the best, etc., which you definitely do not know, and you need to gain information from other societal narratives, which means that the decisions that you will make that way probably have the ability to get influenced more by this. So our case is that even if you make the correct decision, even if you're more likely to make the correct decision on our side, but even if you don't make the correct decision on our side, you're more likely to go ahead and derive utility from the fact that you made the decision. When does a decision be correct, or when is a decision correct or not, is when it gives your life utility. At the point at which you're probably more successful, or you probably are earning more money, but you're still not happy, and your mental health is still fucked, and you're still sad and stressed and in regret for all the things that you did because they were controlled A by society and B not in your control, you're probably going to be left worse off irrespective. For all these reasons, extremely proud to propose.
Okay, I just have a kind speech. I now would like to pause. Here you go. I don't know this.
Am I audible? No one wants it. Yeah, before I begin any final speech, which has been like 2 of them, I'd like to start with a quick round of thank yous. Abhishek for tolerating my ass for like multiple competitions at this point, of being an excellent sporting teammate, carrying me through all of them. Mahor and what's her name? Harshit and Mahor for being excellent juniors. Even if they're not my own, they're always super fun to go against. They've already lost the finals to me, but that clearly wasn't enough for them, so I love you guys. Suhas and Sunkara, people I always looked up to, and obviously Angad and Vansh for being super fun people to debate with in multiple rounds. With that, I will get to the start of the actual speech. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think OT fails to characterize what short-term goals look like, right? I have no clue at the end of 7 minutes what these goals actually look like. I'm going to do that better as opening competition. I think when you're going ahead and planning for long-term goals, one, you probably research them for a longer amount of time, which means their idea that, hey, guess what, you're not going to want to make a stupid decision and you're going to regret it for the rest of your life is probably unlikely, because you're going to research it more, you care about it more, you ask for other people's advice more, because now you want to know like, is this the best decision I make in the first place? I think I'll talk more about this later about how you're able to backward decisions better. But I think secondly, when you plan for long-term goal, it isn't just one long-term goal. You probably strategize it, which means you keep a set of short-term goals to go ahead and achieve that long-term goal. And we think this is incredibly realistic because this is how human beings work, right? We don't decide we'll go engineer and that's the end of it. We probably go, I want to go to this college, I want to get this kind of job, this is what I want to progress my life in. And that's going to be the likelihood of how long-term makes. Which means you make stops and decisions on every single part of the way and you don't make a completely arbitrary decision for your future. But it's important to note that long-term decisions and short-term decisions often contradict, right? No, because one, look, the point at which you're taking only short-term decisions, you always, when you're making a decision, you look to maximize your utility at the end of towards the end of the decision, which means you maximize the short-term utility on their side of the house. I think this is incredibly problematic because when you're going to live your entire life, you probably have very limited resources within your life, and this is important, right? Because if you're trying to maximize your utility towards the end of the short term, then often comes in at a contradiction to those long-term goals, because now you prioritize things like being happy right now and buying clothes for yourself right now because that's what's more important to you than what long-term is, which means you're actively draining resources that you could have possibly used towards your long-term future planning and what makes you happy later on. And this is going to be important in the debate, right? But also, I think the opt-out mechanism and how you're able to process your reality and what makes you happy is much better on our side of the house. Engaging with opening gambit. One, I think you're able to zoom out and find the root cause of what makes you unhappy, because you're not just jumping from goal to goal. If you think a singular goal is making you unhappy right now, the most likely thing you're able to do is follow a narrative and jump onto a different goal, trying to find for happiness in every single narrative that exists. I think at that point, the level of self-introspection is incredibly low, which doesn't happen in a long-term goal because you realize you're unhappy right now, but you're also stuck with this goal for a while. So two things happen. One, you actually go ahead and find the root cause of your unhappiness and try to fix that within the scope of your long-term goal, trying to make yourself a better and a happier individual. Or secondly, we think you get rid of the long-term goal altogether. We don't think long-term goals have to be permanent, right? Because A, when you're thinking of long-term goals, you're thinking of yourself 40 years in the future and what kind of person you're trying to look like. So if you think that you're not becoming the person with your current goal, you're going to change that goal, which means your plans constantly evolving and changing, and the level of opt-out you have is better on our side of the house. On their side of the house, you constantly just have to be like, okay, this is not making me happy, try to experiment. Yeah.
Yeah, how does social impact social society?
You tell me. Cool. Let's go ahead and actually talk about what this debate is actually about, right? Because we need to ask ourselves a question: what actually makes you happy? One, I think you need to make suitable compromises both between the present and the future. In order to become happy, you can't just have one thing and be like, this will make me happy forever. That's unlikely to happen in normal human being. I think you need to make those sacrifices for both cases. As a point, the only time that happens is when you're able to completely understand your requirements and what is it like, what you actually need, both right now and in the future. It's only when you go ahead and have long-term planning do you actually have access to all of this information, epistemic access, that actually allows you to go ahead and say what you want to do and how you want to live your life in a manner that makes you happy both right now and this. I think this compromise and sacrifice happens better in long-term goals and is essentially happy in order for you to go ahead and be a better person, right? But also, how do people ascribe values in status quo and what do they want? Because I understand most people look for hope, and this is incredibly important, right? Because there's so many narratives that are actively surrounding you that OG also talk about. But the question is, how do you choose between these narratives? Because incredibly, you get swallowed by these narratives and you feel lost a lot of the time. CT also tries to talk about this in terms of social media and whatnot, right? But the bigger impact over here is you feel incredibly lost because you don't know what to do. On their side, you jump between narratives trying to find happiness. I think we're able to do much better on our side of the house, right? Because we have an active value you want to aspire to 40 years down the future, which means you plan for that, which means you always have hope that, hey, this is a goal I have been following and I will follow it for the future. This is the person I want to become. This hope sustains your happiness, sustains the kind of person you want to be at your progression in life. It's very easy to feel lost on their side of the house because you don't know what you're doing, you don't know what your next plan is. On our side of the house, you have something to ascribe to, which means you probably cannot feel lost. But secondly, on the idea of jobs and career and how this happens. Because see, there's a societal pressure, a heavy one, to go ahead and maximize your career. This is important because career success requires a long-term view, and this is particularly important because a lot of things in your life probably need a long-term view. For example, career, because it rewards you for starting early. If you start coaching in 12th grade when you have exams in 3 months, the society is not going to reward you with a great college. It's when you make long-term plans for yourself and tell yourself that this is what I want to do and actually create change, that's when you have career success. Similarly in jobs, when you ascribe, I want to be the CEO of this company, and position yourself in a manner that allows you to be the CEO of the company, that's when you go ahead and actually make that change. On their side of the house, you constantly sacrifice this for what makes you happy right now. You're not able to position yourself in the way society wants you to, and you're not able to progress. I think this also really screws you up in terms of risk taking, like in terms of financials, right? Because you understand financial decisions stay with you for the entirety of your life. It's not the first time you're taking a decision, and these are going to last a long time. Especially young people who like to leverage their futures in short-term decisions, thinking I have enough life, I'll probably make some money later, I can make bad decisions right now, or I can take high-risk decisions right now. These are going to hurt you because you lose a lot of resources for your potential self in the future. Two outcomes of this. One, I think this hurts your retirement and your entire life because now you can't go ahead and actually live the kind of life you want to later. But secondly, also it's difficult for you to form relationships and whatnot because you feel like people feel you're financially unstable because of the high amount of risk you take because you only look at short term. But also, most importantly, you hate your past self constantly. You always think this person who was before me was an idiot. It's hard for you to move on because you're recovering from the trauma. Actively, you are still making wrong short-term bad decisions, and therefore it's incredibly important for you to heal from those decisions and move on. I think it happens better on our side when you're more risk-averse because you plan for your future and decide what's important for your future. But thirdly, I think similar things apply to relationships right now, right? Because again, you're likely to do what makes you feel happy right now, even if it comes at the expense of a long-term commitment, something you probably wanted later. Because again, societal narratives tell you to have long-term commitments. At the point at which you choose against that and do only what makes you happy right now, you're most likely going to damage your relationship in ways because you prioritize yourself over the partner because that makes you happy right now. What this leads to is breaking up relationships when it itself is not pragmatic. But the point is, you maximize short-term utility, which means you have a fear of getting hurt again because your previous relationship went bad because you made short-term decisions, which means you're unlikely to opt into relationships or become vulnerable enough to actually create meaningful, sustainable relationships because you don't care about how they look in the future, you only care about them right now. Your life is fucked, your money is fucked, and your life is fucked. I'd like to end this debate. Thank you.
Great, I had clear the population for that fine speech, and now it's right EPM.
Can you hear me? I heard you. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. One of the metrics that we gave to you in terms of what it means to take the best possible decision is one where you comprehend things completely and one where you have less regret. Most of opening opposition's case is that if you do consider only short-term things, if you do only consider like the value that you derive, say next year from a decision or like in the next few months from it, it's a bad thing, right? So then we give you 3 clear reasons as to why it's not the case. One, we told you that you don't even know if you will be alive for like that particular point of time in the future or not, right? Which means you can't like go ahead and experience the benefits of that particular decision if you consider only the long-term factors or give it that much importance. It's like the certainty of utility that you can derive from a decision is much greater in the short term, which means it's completely fine for me to prioritize whether I'm happy in a relationship for the next year or not. Wake up with that question because I don't know whether in like the next 3 years I will be alive at that point of time. But secondly, we tell you that the people's choices are something that does change quite dynamically, right? No matter how much I'm opposed to change, because of the way in which the world does change around me, there is potential to what I consider, what I like and what I dislike changing over time, right? Which means you probably probably will not enjoy the decision that you made 10, like right now, 10 years later, if you as an individual go ahead and change. But thirdly, we tell you the impact of what's happening in the short term is much more certain. You know that if you go ahead and spend some amount of your money in order to like say buy a bike that you like, rather than like complete the mortgage of your house much more quickly, we know that you will like have some sort of short-term happiness that is certain and that you can go ahead and enjoy. On the other hand, we're not sure if you put this off for the next 3 or 4 years, whether you actually will be able to afford that vehicle and get that, like actually realize that happiness or not in the first place. We think that because of this, it's completely fine for an individual to prioritize only the short-term like considerations while making a decision that is a stance we're willing to take. But then the other couple of things that they told you is in terms of long-term decisions and what actually influences you when you make this, right? We told you the only way in which you can conceptualize what happens in the long term is largely by the way in which other people and society influences you, right? Because you as an individual are constrained by like, the amount of time you have, the amount of like brain power you have to potentially predict the future and see how it goes. Which is why we told you it is much more likely that you will listen to what society says about how the future is going to be, right? When your parents tell you because they are much more experienced people. When media tells you that this is probably how like finances, no thank you, are going to be in the future, you're probably going to be influenced by that significantly more. The problem with this is what Mahor identified, right? Is in terms of regret. At the point at which we're able to show people that we are the side that reduces regret and the kind of like regretful decisions people make, we take this, right? Why is that the case? One, regret is like a very negative emotion when it comes to people. Right? When you constantly keep doubting the kind of decisions that you take, we think that you're going to be significantly sad. This kind of doubt is going to be much greater when you take long-term considerations while making a decision because of the reasons that we told you in our first speech, right? It's unlikely that that decision is going to be successful because of the kind of uncertainty that exists. Which means when things don't go your way, which is much more likely in multiple cases, no thank you, we think that is when you are going to feel regret way more, right? This is not just because that like society changes and things change. It's often likely that when you set these long-term goals, when you consider them, you're often going to set high and lofty goals for yourself, right? Like you want to feel nice about the kind of goals that you're setting, which means when you set like a career goal, instead of looking at immediate happiness, the kind of effort that you need to take, and like how happy you need to be during that time, you're probably going to set like goals that are not even achievable for you in the future, right? This is probably like the second reason why it's unlikely that things are going to be successful, which is why we think that regret is something that is absolutely deplorable. But secondly, we think that, like before I move on, sure.
When you make a long-term decision, you make a series of short-term decisions to plan the long-term decision. So when happiness is still there, I don't see a metric of regret.
Couple of responses to that, right? Even if it's a series of short-term decisions, the way you make the further decisions are based on what, like the way the first decision, the outcome comes, is how you go ahead and decide future things work out, right? Which is the uncertainty that we're talking about. If things don't turn out the way that you want to in the next year, all the considerations that you would have made with respect to your career plan is unlikely to work out in the best possible way, right? But secondly, we think that people are unlikely to go ahead and embrace the change the way you're talking about, in that like I do decide to give JE and not get into an IIT. I'll probably be happy and go into the second local college and do whatever I am according to opening opposition, right? That's unlikely to be true for a couple of reasons. One, humans are egotistical human like creatures, right? Like we want to think that we have been right and we made the right decision in the future, like in the past, right? And secondly, we think that it's because of the sum cost that you've already put in when it comes to making that decision, and pursuing that path, right? Which is probably why instead of going ahead and changing and being dynamic about your choices in the future, it is much more likely that you feel bad about what you did and bad about the kind of decisions that you took. What did we tell you in terms of the real impacts of this when it comes to say relationships, right? We told you that at the point at which you don't like feel happy being in a relationship, there is absolutely no reason to go ahead and give it like much longer and look at the future, right? If you're somebody that's not getting married until 30, looking at Acharya, it's unlikely that you want to break up with your girlfriend at that point of time because you're scared that the older you go, it's harder for you to go ahead and get married. The problem with this is that you're not prioritizing the kind of happiness that you get in the short term, which is often much more certain. Secondly, in terms of financial decisions, we still don't think that people are like completely going to throw away their like money and go to France and settle down, right? Like you probably are going to consider some amount of long-termism when it comes into this, like what happens in the next year, right? And what happens like not just in the next month. These are things that by the very influences that you were talking about in terms of the way society scares you about the future, you're probably going to consider this. What we're telling you is that considering these as the majority reasons for making a decision and main calculus while making it is the one that is particularly problematic. What did we tell you at the end of the day? The best decision is one where you can understand things completely, and the best possible way is only when you make short-term decisions, because they are things that are in your control, that you understand out of your own volition, and that don't change much drastically. Secondly, we told you that reducing regret is something that is uniquely possible only on our side of the house, because you know why a decision failed when it went ahead and failed. But even if it did fail, you're not too sad about it, because you can go ahead and look at what you want in the next immediate future and change your actions accordingly. On your side of the house, people are often stuck with an initial plan that they made. They often don't want to give up the sunk cost that's already been put into that decision, which means they're going to be sadder and it's going to be a worse world to live in for all those reasons. Opening up.
Okay, I have people who find speech, be alone whenever you're ready.
Okay, holding up this mic.
Or you can just hold it.
Yeah. Starting my speech then in 3, 2, 1. At the end of OG's speech, what do you get? Nothing. I just check your notes. I don't think you can visualize what job decisions look like. I don't think you can visualize what long-term financial decisions look like. I don't think you can visualize what they're actually going to do in groups. Right? You don't know enough examples. You also don't make out how exactly people are going to make decisions apart from debate facts. That being said, then, what's the largest mistake that they make? And probably see even make the same mistake, right? I don't think you can separate the person from his surroundings. OG's argument fails because people don't exist in a vacuum. They also aren't able to prove to me why exactly people are able to make decisions or understand decisions independent of their surroundings, right? Note over here, my existence is an amorphous composition of my own thoughts, my experiences, my parents, the society around me, my friends, their expectations, their experiences, right? I don't think this can be separated in terms of processing a lived reality. Very crucially over here, even short-term decisions are based on these same amorphous metrics. Because you know what, I'm making these short-term decisions based on what I think is good, probably what the celebrities and what I'm following, my friends, etc. Right? I'm not sure that these are not subject to similar social expectations, not probably from your parents, but probably from your friends and surroundings. Next up. What is the exact difference between short-term and long-term decisions, right? The very simple idea is leverage. Note over here, when you're making short-term decisions, you're probably trying to solve problems that are proximate to you and trying to best solve them. It could be I'm unhappy, I want to be happy. It could be that, you know what, there's an urgent crisis and you want to solve it. Different things along those lines, proximate problems. Note over here, when you utilize your leverage, it could be in terms of time, it could be in terms of resources. You probably over-expedite those resources or overspend them because not necessarily considering, do I need these resources in the future? Do I need them for someone else? Do I need them from someone else? Do I need somewhere else? Note over here for all the problems that it pose, in terms of relationship that we back out or not, in terms of financial decision, what I buy, what I don't buy, the difference over here between our two houses is that we probably retain more leverage because we realize that we need to preserve some resources for decisions we need to make in the future. Next up, I think just clarifying the idea on needs, right? At the point of time I'm thinking that I need to make some future decisions, I probably realize I need a vehicle for transport, I probably realize I need a house, etc. The difference is what exactly is a model that I'm buying. Once again, the difference comes in that I don't think you're probably going to exchange a bike for the mortgage. It's probably going to end up buying a cheaper bike on our side of the house and still attain everything that they wish to. But note over here, let's take on the entire idea of regret because that's the only thing standing from their side. Three ideas over here. Firstly, at the point of time people make decisions, people also make backups, right? It's not like I want to aim for the thing towards, which means if you're not working towards it, I'm not sure the next domino falls for you. Now you're making the problem, if you don't get into a good college, that probably hampers the chance of getting a good job and subsequently all future aspirations you have. I'm not sure why you're moving a progression along those paths. But most importantly, understand three things on regret. A, expectations that your parents had, the society had still exists, which means even in a short-term framework and they are made happy with the short-term decision, there's still the pressure of getting a good job, getting a good college still exists. They still make you unhappy. That doesn't go away on their side. Second thing, people are able to feel happiness through small accomplishments. Doing well in a test makes me happy even if I'm not the topper, even if let's say that doesn't guarantee me getting a good job. At that point I'm taking small steps and I'm able to do them. I'm able to see myself progress. That still makes me happy, that still keeps me sane. But we realize people always exist on a comparative metric, right? I don't think they actually take away Rohan's analysis over here, where Rohan points out that look, if you see other people progressing faster than you, even if you're making a short term decision or making you happy in the short term, right? You still feel bad over the long term because you're seeing these people who are with you in the same starting line, but now moving further and further away from you, feel jealousy, but also expedited by the social pressure who always constantly compare you and that other person. Yeah. Before this, let's also take that broader level societal decision making. Note over here there are three things, right? If let's say closing government wants to talk about government, social movements, etc. There are two things to consider. In the same argument, leverage. Note over here, governments want to solve proximal problems. Maybe the election is coming up, probably you want to appease the voter base of there. Probably you can freebie that Aam Aadmi Party in every state that they're campaigning. But you don't realize it puts them in fiscal debt that doesn't allow them to fund future policies and the infrastructure right now. That is the same thing that happens when you're considering short-term approximate problems more than the future consideration of what actually happened. Look at social movements, right? Maybe Trump passes a policy that's very authoritative, very angry at it. Do you express your anger at it? Do you all go to the street right now and maybe get violent? What do you do? Similarly, in environmental causes or any other causes. Note here that instantaneous burst of anger and may give you more fulfillment, may actually allow you to express it out there, may not be the best thing for a social movement in the future, but once again, that doesn't allow you to attain your long-term goal. Because one very important thing in this debate, a problem exists, that problem is the cause of your worry. For people, it could be my parental expectations, so that will pressure my own aspirations. For governments, it could be their voter base. For social movements, it could be inherent oppression in society. At the point where the problem still exists, the issues caused by the problem will plague you until the problem is solved. On their side, even if momentarily you're feeling happiness and overcomes the issue the problem causes, they're not necessarily moving towards solving the problem itself. Only on our side, are you at least taking steps, are you at least taking backups that allow you to solve this problem? CO, CD. Okay.
At the point at which you set a goal to yourself and you make backups, won't you have regret at the point that you don't achieve the first goal?
But you have more regret on your side, right? Because note over here, even if you're, let's say, considering hedonism, even if you're going on vacations, etc., that still doesn't mean that you're free of any aspirations, right? That still means you probably still, based on a TV series you watch and everything else you know, have a certain degree of life that you wish to aspire. On your side, you're not making any progress, it doesn't even come into that lived reality, and all the pressure that you describe still exists, that makes you more unhappy, that makes you feel more regret, that makes you not answer the house. On the comparative regret, they're clearly better than them. Note over here then how exactly it does this debate. I think the metrics are very simple. Firstly, where are you happy with decisions you have made? And B, where are you happy with yourself? In terms of decisions you have made, on our side, each and every decision, A gives you a feedback of happiness. That probably happens on their side as well. The difference is that we are walking on a constant path wherein these happinesses stack up and move towards a larger happiness, move towards a larger goal. It's until the stacking up and its compounding happens on their side, because it seems that we're probably talking about more isolated instances that do not necessarily coalesce. But secondly, where you're happy with yourself, right? At the point in time, relative metrics comparison exists between people. At the point in time, there exists standards in society where people are judged if they don't achieve a certain thing. That would mean that pressures symmetrically apply to all people's mind. At that point in time, then, if we are able to show, which we have shown, that we are probably better able to move towards a target, or at least proximate to a target, you probably feel happy with yourself at the end of the day on our side. As a government, as a social movement for not taking a action decision, etc., or as a person who moved towards your goal, as compared to side opposition, as compared to side government, but it probably are much further away than we are. Very, very proud to oppose.
Okay, I had a look at the time speech of the job. How to open the back half and up.
Guys, here you go.
Okay, thank you so much. Sorry about that. Alright. Sorry for swearing. I just ready. Starting my speech. I'm gonna be that weird guy at the party who's gonna take the debate away from relationships and retirement funds into feeding the poor. That's what I mean. Okay. So 3 things in this speech, right? Firstly, how this affects decision making and policies and policy bodies like the World Bank, like the UNESCO, like Parliament, etc., etc. Secondly, why short-term decision making is better in those instances. Thirdly, weighing it upwards, the opening up frame of specifically when individualistic decision making and how that affects that, right? I think if we are able to prove to you that this actually ends up like feeding the poor and stuff like that, I think it's when the debate just plays on the field, right? Okay. Having said that, all the report will be integrated. I'm kind of not going to engage with a frame on opening half because I don't think I really need to. Okay. So firstly, in decision making processes within policy bodies. No, that policy bodies have to sit down, they have to make decisions, right? Like places like the World Bank, you have to sit down and decide what kind of charities do you want to run, what kind of food do you want to give, what kind of aid programs do you want to run, etc., etc. Parliament has to sit down and think about what kind of policies it wants to pass, etc., etc., right? So this debate affects how that decision making process happens, what kind of things are discussed, what kind of policies are even seen as legitimate in those cases, right? In that instance, I think that the view to long-termist thinking has 2 specific arms that are really problematic. First, long-termist thinking often promotes ideology over actual practical effects of the policy. Right? The reason for this is that long-term always exists in the abstract, and also that long-term often construes with the ideology of the individual. When I think about the long-term impacts of something, I'm thinking about how that world is constructed in my head. Right? In those instances, I'm thinking, how should that world be constructed in the first place? And that's where my ideology comes into picture. Right? If I'm a free market advocate, my long-termist vision is always going to be one in which I think the free market should reign supreme, as opposed to someone who's maybe more into government intervention, right? That means that these ideological differences come into play. This is important because these tiny ideological differences between different people can actually significantly impact the discussions that actually happen there, right? Because if I'm slightly more interventionist and someone is slightly more free market, the fact that we always have to think that the view to the long term means that every time we discuss certain policy decisions that we need to make, we always think how it is going to affect business decisions long into the future as opposed to what is happening now. This leads to incredible policy deadlock, right? This means that the decisions are going to take far longer to take and its resources are committed directly into these bodies themselves rather than into carrying out the things that the bodies actually need to do. This delays these decisions that can take place and holds back the existing resources that can exist. Note, in the status quo, there's many studies that show that charities in the status quo have just hold back savings for so long because they just don't deploy them because they don't know exactly where to deploy them in the first place. Right? This is hugely problematic and affects how it happens in the decision making table. The second thing that happens in this instance is that you get just plain bad policy. The reason for this is that a lot of people, when they think ideologically, often is ignore the direct consequences, right? If you have to take this to someone like Milton Friedman, who comes up with his advocacy of like direct free market policies, right? When he puts it in a country like Chile, and there are like as soon as he implements it, there are horrible policies, the horrible effects that are happening to the poor because of these policies, because they're getting screwed over, because there's no government support, no welfare, etc., etc. The thing that these policy advocates can then say is that it's okay because in the long term this will all sort itself out, right? At that point, this is straight up bad policy, and in instances this is not the correct long-term decision to take. At that point, this is just a net harm in the world that simply needs to be corrected in the future. At that point, there's no good thing that ever comes out of this. Right? There's a huge net harm that actually ends up happening, which means policies are going to get policies that could be potentially incredibly disastrous policies, but also more importantly, policies in general get deadlocked and delayed. Right? I'll take you a little later, right? Sit up. Short-term. Now, why is short-termist thinking better? Right? I already explained why ideology is unlikely to involved, but I also want to explain why it's easier to weigh harms and benefits of these policies when you can see the direct impacts of these policies. Like when you say that instead of thinking about how we can set up like Africa for like success, you just think we will ship food out to people in Africa. Like we will literally just send container ships, etc., etc. We will serve food. Why does this actually end up going to be better than the alternative? Right? One, I think it takes a bottom-up effect. Right? When people in Africa actually end up there, when these people actually get nutritious food and they're able to like actually work better, think better, etc., etc. When child malnutrition can be ended directly and things like that, it actually creates a bottom-up effect where they can take themselves and create economic processes and institutions within their own countries, which otherwise could not have happened without this direct intervention that only happens on our side of the house when ideology is not involved. More importantly, these short-term decisions are held more accountable because the direct impacts are seen in the public, right? So people can see if this is going to create a harm, they can iterate on it. Thirdly, it is an iterative process, right? The policy delay that I talked about means that in in the instance on their side of the house, when you have long-termist thinking, the delay means that the policy is enacted, then you see what happens, and then you have to iterate on that in like the future. On our side of the house, iteration is much faster. I think iteration is generally better. So say you ship food to Africa, and some of the food just gets spoiled because there's no granaries, right? Then you just build granaries next, right? That's how the iterative process is better, as opposed to waiting 3 years, then deciding to ship food, and then waiting another 3 years to decide what the policy needs to be taken in the future, right? That actually directly helps these people far more, right? Before I move on, I'll take over. So,
your idea of inaction is an assertion. We tell you we create a series of short-term plans to actualize that long-term goal, but we also have backup plans on our side.
It's a relative degree, guys. You can't just say that, like, sure, you may have short-term steps, but it's just far more iterative on our side of the house. Like, you can't possibly argue that like this, that on your side you get both, right? Okay. Now opposition might come out and say like, okay, but what about some long-term goals that we want to achieve, like eradicating poverty, climate change, etc. Right? I think firstly, in terms of eradicating poverty, you already shown there's a bottom-up mechanism that exists that can actually help far better. Right? But secondly, in terms of climate change, I think firstly, I just want to point out there are many mechanisms to fight climate change. It's unclear why long-termist thinking in particular is required. Insofar as things like technology, better like renewables, etc. are required. And there are many reasons why these renewables are already cheaper, etc. A short-termist policy would just say that we will implement these renewables because they're already cheaper and the status quo, but also just directly investing in technology and instead of delaying it and thinking about which technology is better, etc., means you get direct impact, and that iterative process that I already described creates more impact. The onus is on them if they want to talk about these long-term challenges to prove that long-termist thinking actually even works to solve this in the first place. Finally, I'm going to weigh off versus opening house individualistic thinkers. Firstly, I just want to point out that the resources increase that we're talking about, like directly feeding people and stuff like that, has a net increase in utility by a much larger amount in the potential increase in utility that have in terms of long-term and short-term thinking on the individual level, right? We just have more resources for people, and people are more happy when they're more happy in general, right? But secondly, I just want to point out we have the most vulnerable people when I talk about the decision-making process and, like how charities and etc. make the decisions to the World Bank, etc., etc. These are helping people, who are poor, vulnerable, minorities, etc., which are just more important stakeholders to consider in general, right? But also, more importantly, I think that they fail to consider that at the individual level, fail to show the exact delta, because I think it ends up being kind of a wash as to what is the delta in increase in utility. I can probably be persuaded by either side, but at the end of the day, I think this is a far bigger increase, right? I think for all these reasons, I'm incredibly proud to propose.
Okay. Before I start, I think everybody has also done their thank you speeches. So thanks to Angad for being the senior that he is. I set it up plenty of times, and I'll use the RP platform to do that as well. To all three teams in the final, I've looked up to a lot of you for a lot of debates and for a lot of the debating experiences. And for people in the crowd, extremely thanks for being here, listening to us. And finally, just to RP, I think we used to hear these debates on YouTube, and it's nice to stand on this platform. POIs after 5 from OG. Yeah, but I can't. I think if I don't, Angad will take it. 3, 2, 1. The debate up until now has been about which kind of decision making inherently is better, i.e., which kind of decision is better or not. We think individuals or this debate or people in this debate do not have the epistemic access to judge as to which kind of decision is better or not. I think the better mechanism or the way in which CEO enters the debate is the explanation of why processing of failure is significantly better on our side of the house as opposed to at Gov, where you are constantly in a void of overthinking. I think O just asserts this without explaining as to how the human mind functions. Let's start with processing failure and why this is the most important material in the debate. The first thing I want to point out is at the point where you think in the short term, you create a massive vacuum for all of the possible decisions that you make in the future. Because you put all your eggs in the one basket, and the expectation out of that short term goal is that you are going to get massive amounts of success and a proportionate return of investment out of that specific goal. What that presumably means that at the point at which you receive failure in the short term decision is the point where it incapacitates you for making future decisions for the simple reason that your ability to process the the previous failure is significantly higher, is significantly worse off. Because at Gov, there is a massive time lag that has happened at the point at which you as an individual at the start of this short-term decision chose not to consider other ramifications or chose not to have backups, as O points out. But the way in which we differentiate from opening opposition is the explanation of why individuals feel it feels significantly harder to go ahead and make future decisions. Why is that the case? I think there are three simple reasons which are debate winning. The first thing I want to point out is that this is a massive sunk cost. Because note, the comparative on their side is that you presumably go to a casino and spend the entire 10,000 that you have, versus on our side where you probably can go to a casino but still spend less, probably $1,000, because you care about the long-term goals. What that presumably means is that you sparse out the risk over a period of time and over an entire time duration, as opposed to putting all of your eggs in the one basket. Which means that in the instances where you fail, your ability to go and recover from the kind of cost that you incurred to making that decision is significantly worse off at the point at which you have lost so much, which presumably means that your ability to process the trauma in the interim becomes significantly harder. The second thing to then point out is that you have absolutely no support at the point at which you get failure in the short term. And this is where I want to clarify and differentiate from opening opposition. The way we win this is the explanation, not how. The way we win this is the explanation of why the prioritization of the short-term goal means that you prioritize yourself as opposed to caring about other ramifications. This is where the nature of short-term decision making is inherently things like tunnel vision. Why is that the case? Because in the vast majority of cases, the human mind is probably hardwired to prioritize or to just process smaller things. So presumably on their side of the house, you put all of the eggs in the one basket as opposed to caring about other arbitrary factors as well. This is where we clash with opening government by explaining that the long-term goal isn't an inherent homogeneous entity. Presumably you add incremental short-term goals to achieve that long-term goal, which means that you can get some amount of happiness in the short term, but in the instances where you get failure, which opening opposition does not engage with, we simply prove to you that you still have the ability to make future decisions even if you fail in this specific decision. Why is that the case? The first thing to simply point out here is that you are willing to, at the point at which you made a long-term decision at the start, you realize that presumably you are going to face failures in the entire process as well. As long as that is the case, we think individuals in the vast majority of cases probably do not look back because they were already prepared to face those failures. As long as that is the case, we think you are not in an endless cycle of overthinking as to why I made the wrong decision, even if a short-term decision specifically failed. But the second thing to point out is that you can actively just believe that you hard worked, or you probably already put as much amount of effort that you possibly could, as opposed to on their side of the house where you constantly blame the entire hard work for your failure and you think that you probably did not do as much, because we think sadness comes at the point at which a decision fails. This is where we explain to you that even if uncertainty is a metric that opening government can specifically claim, what we simply prove is that the amount of happiness that you can get out of a short-term decision is anyways lesser, but in the instances where the short-term decision fails, you are able to better process this. Why is happiness also uncertain on their side of the house, and this washes off opening government? The first thing I want to point out is presumably at the point at which you have a massive investment that you put into the short-term decision, often what tends to happen is that you are looking probably for a proportionate return. So today, if I invested 20,000 rupees to go to Goa, but I did not get the amount of happiness that I wanted out of the 20,000, we think you are probably going to be even more unsatisfied at the point at which you think that the investment did not have a proportionate return. As long as that is the case, there is an equal likelihood and an equal uncertainty of short-term goals bringing some amount of grief to you. Opening government had to do much more legwork in explaining as to why short-term decisions can make you happy. Why is processing failure then the most important incentive in this debate? The first thing I want to simply point out is that your ability to pursue the long-term goal can only be achieved at the point at which you are able to process this failure. We think on their side of the house, you cannot make another short-term decision at the point at which you have been incapacitated at the initial stage because there's a massive void, as I already explained. But secondly, on macro impacts and why we are winning on the social justice movement bit as well. The first thing I want to simply point out is that large macro structures like social justice movements are likely to opt into things like larger change and more radical change on their side of the house at the point at which you have to achieve some amount of success in the short term, which means that you put a massive amounts of pressure on social justice movements and individuals within social justice movements to actually achieve a lot of change in the short amount of time, which presumably means that you have to argue for things like more radical things as opposed to arguing with the state who is anyways antithetical to you. So we think the best way to actually achieve change in society is by you probably prioritizing things in the long term. So probably you should be more willing to make concessions in the short term as opposed to caring about only short term goals and only achieving short term happiness. This is where we think that individuals in the movement and individuals independently as well feel more burdened at the point at which they have to pursue a short term goal for the simple reason that you look for success at the end of the short term goal. But note, at the point at which you make a long term decision, you think that you probably are inevitably going to face failure at some amount of time as opposed to on their side of the house where you are incapacitated to process failure in the vast majority of cases. But the final thing to then point out on social justice movements is to say that governments are most likely to give you bandit solutions, because note, governments are most likely to make popular policies as opposed to unpopular policies. So Manmohan Singh opening up the markets in 91 was not a very popular thing as long as it still harmed farmers, but presumably the reason why Manmohan Singh did it was simply because he was looking to the long term. So as long as on their side of the house you give larger government structures and macro structures and opt out of solving a larger problem, is the point where you form less quality policies or policies that can actually benefit people in the long term. This is where we think that the amount of accountability that governments can now have is significantly lesser at the point at which governments are not accountable to you anymore, because the simple excuse that they have is that you had a short-term solution and we gave you the short-term solution or what you were specifically wanting. But the final thing to then point out is that gov benches do not have a counterfactual in this debate, because we think at the point at which there are large macro structures that specifically exist and their family or other societal forces that work, we think gov bench is an active burden to prove as to why the counterfactual is likely. But we think CT's idea of how ideology, you shift to ideology is, I think, uncomparative, because it is very easy for political structures to appeal to your ideology, and this is where we think that probably they're going to do it in the short term as well. So I think CT is out of the debate, proud to oppose.
Great, I thank members all for a fine speech. That's it, whenever you're ready.
Are you good to go? Yeah. Starting in 3, 2, 1, go. I think Suhas is the only one in this debate who told you how societal impacts in this, actual societal impacts in this particular motion that regards to the decision-making process leads to better results for people that are not hypothetical, right? I think all three of these other benches talked about potential individual changes that don't really have much delta. This particular delta actually, this particular impact about societal organizations actually have concrete evidence, concrete reasoning show you why it creates that impact, right? I'm not gonna split opposition bench into two parts. I'm gonna deal with them as a whole, right? Firstly, I'm gonna split this in like mitigations and a final way on mitigating some certain ideas, and this is going to be a lot, right? First, on this idea of career that comes out from opening opposition, right? They say that opening opposition. They say that you need to get career success, you need a long-term understanding, right? I don't really think this is true. I think a lot of cases, career success comes from short-term iterative moments. That is, I want to get a promotion right now, I will work harder to get it right now. More importantly, I'm not really sure why it's even necessary that your career success needs to be long-term, right? Why can't I just do the best I can in the job I have right now, which is necessarily a short-term thinking to get the money you want, and if you don't mind it, like just get another career later, right? I don't really think why getting that career success is so important in the first place. Secondly, I think this is regards to things like retirement savings and stuff like that, right? I think notice this is a long-term decision making also is and these things like retirement savings, etc., are probably still told to you in some manner. They're probably still taught to you in school that it might be good to save. The difference here is when the individual is making the decision making process, they're probably less likely to do that. We conceded that, but we still think it exists to some extent. Maybe people save less, maybe people would gamble a little bit more, but we think okay, to some extent people would still save. It's not like they're just fucking over their lives completely, right? So three, we think and this is kind of important, right? We think that being better prepared short term puts you in a better mental situation to think about the long term calmly, right? Notice the point time when we address your short term needs, especially for the more vulnerable people of society, they get better security, they have more money, they have a fallback option and a security net to make risks in their life. Let's say right now on their side of the house, people have to make a choice of making the safer career move, because what if they fuck up and lose a lot of money? The point time when in the short term they have a lot of money already, they might make riskier long term moves that could actually potentially be more useful for these people. I'll take your view.
Okay, why is your framing that organizations are benevolent is true as compared to opening up framing that organization or maximize their own benefits? Especially, why is the speculative benefits that you gain more than let's say the potential harm of appeasement politics and other things that we point out?
Okay, so I think the things we're talking about here are already being debated, right? Notice the things like helping people in Africa are being debated by international organizations, especially charities, but they're not being implemented because charities like, oh, what if this money could be used in the long term for a better purpose, which then they just keep having that ideology and put in a deadlock. But we're talking about policies that just don't come up at all. Maybe at the point in time where more people think about the short term and more people care about the short term, and the people are being affected by short term problems, push for this particular thing in society, more people see it and more people care about it, which means probably are going to talk about more on our side of us. Coming to the like further mitigations, right? I think the last thing I was talking about is how being better prepared short term, the other way to clearly think more better about the long term if you want to think about the long term. The second, further mitigation on like social justice movements, I think this is specifically coming to targeting CEO, right? I think they just talk about social justice movements, but don't you think social justice movements apply in this particular debate, right? Notice this is about decision-making processes. I don't understand how a coalition of billions of individuals can ever come to make a decision. We think the point in time where a lot of the decisions made in social justice movements are made in the short term. Things like protests happening in the next week. Things like these, like smaller subgroups are the ones that make sure decisions become social movements, and these necessarily could happen on a short-term basis also. So dealing with like relationships, right? I think in relationships, and this is dealing with OG's specific individual claim, I think problem with relationships is I don't really understand why long-term thinking is necessarily good, right? Notice that love and things like that and human emotions are irrational in nature. The point time where you potentially see things like red flags in the short term, but then the idea of being in love with this person corrupts you and and the point time you think long term and you're like, oh, maybe I love this person so much I could move past these red flags and be with them in the long term. I think all these necessarily things, basically my point here is I don't necessarily think that thinking in the long term is good for human relationships and things like that. I think a lot of these individual cluster points by both opposition teams are ironic, right? They're supposed to support long-term deep thinking, but none of these claims have any sort of nuance in them. Coming to the weighing, I think this weighing is going to be divided into two things, right? It's proving Suhas' impact. I think the first point in weighing is going to be on long-term policy versus short-term policy, and the second about individuals versus society. Before that, I just want to give a brief clarification on the top-down approach that they're proposing versus Suhas' bottom-up approach. Think of like what they're proposing is that you think of a 100-year-old goal, and then you start thinking of the smaller subsets that necessarily come out of that goal. Suhas pointed out to you, the point that you're thinking only of the 100-goal year at the start, people get into deadlock based on ideological differences. Whether you want that 100-year world to be based on socialist policy or capitalist policies. Notice more in the future you think, the more policy, the more the abstract keeps in and the ideological differences kick in and affect these particular things, which is the reason you get into deadlock. When Suhas talks about instead of talking about Africa hundreds in the future, we'll just feed the African people right now. That's easier to accept because this is simply more concrete and simply more of a common good that happens right now. I'm not taking it to you. And this is simply why that earlier example of the effective altruism charities with all money right now, right? With the point time is money is going to be deadlocked, not going to be used. We think we'd rather just make it be used right now and get the net utility right now than potentially waiting for a quote-unquote better use into the future. Weighing on long-term policy versus short-term policy. One, the earlier mentioned policy deadlock due to ideological differences simply means that long-term policies are a lot harder to make, in a common, better way. Two, we think specific issues that they have problems with, the only problems they have in long-term policy is the one issue of climate change. Right? We think tech improvement is iterative, right? I make chips, I work as a chip engineer, we make chips based on the next 3-year cycles. We improve on a product, we evaluate, we improve on a product even more. We think tech can be improved to solve climate change like this, but more importantly, we can directly see climate change effects happening right now. Islands are sinking, glaciers are melting. We think these people are being affected. These people can push and be like, look, we're having this problem right now. Can you try helping us? So, and we think that lastly, breaking this deadlock, and this is just generally in terms of long-term policy and short-term policy, puts you in iteratively better spots to think about needs in the future. Why? Because the point time when more vulnerable people get out of that state of vulnerability due to policy changes made right now, which means that these vulnerable people can start thinking about structural issues around them and in other places of society, which means you can get more people to think about structural change, and you can get more people to opt into things like politics, etc. Lastly, weighing on individual long-term versus societal impacts, I think this is why we take over opening as well as the other teams in this debate. What we think the earlier mitigations and also competing short-term interests. Sure, like there's another mitigation. We think sure you can invest $1,000 in gambling with $10,000 in gambling, but you probably won't give $10,000 because you have the other short-term needs to pay that money right now. 2, we think we affect more vulnerable people by creating structural change. 3, we think the average influential people on their side of the house are probably fine either way. Worst case, they may lose some retirement savings. Here, we save billions of people to come out of poverty. Last, we simply think we give more net utility to the worst affected members, which are the only vulnerable stakeholders in society. And for that, we're extremely proud to propose.
Great, I thank Dr. for a fine speech. Final speech to the House of
Okay. Am I audible? I'll take a POI at around 5. So don't bother before that. Yeah, also like it's thanks to Vansh for bringing me here and carrying me to finals. That's all I can do right now. Cool. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I want to be very clear where extension stands in this debate because I think 3 benches in this room just go ahead and posit how decision-making processes are better on their side of the house. They say that, oh, you look at, like things like the other factors, there'll be information exposure and all that, and then they say, oh, you want to just maximize utility, so you're going to do like short-term because that's better. I think decisions, whether they are rational or irrational, can sometimes lead to failures, and this is true for most decisions that all people take. The ability for you to go ahead and make peace with that particular failure, or the ability for you to learn from that failure, is where CEO comes into this debate. Because note, when you fail, there are 2 things that happen. One, that you need to process it and come to terms with it. But secondly, I think when you go to fail, society judges you, and there's external validation, that obviously goes ahead and pushes back onto you and says that no, what you did was wrong. I think those 2 things just reinforce a sense of self-doubt in you at all points of time. What do you need to beat those 2 things? One, your ability to go ahead and rationalize a decision to yourself, or rationalize a decision to whoever is going ahead and questioning you. But secondly, you need a support structure. If we are able to prove that one, support structures go down significantly on gov benches, but also the ability for you to rationalize a decision to yourself and push back against anything that's questioning your decision, or there's just shaming you for that particular failure. I think if that's something that you can take out, I think you just live a happier life, primarily because able to go ahead and deal with those failures at that point of time. This is where the idea of less risk and distributed costs come into the picture. Because note, if even the decisions are irrational, even if I want to say in the long term, say after 2 years I want to party in a rave party in Ibiza, it's still good. Why? Because the cost that I'm going to incur for that particular trip is going to be distributed over time. I'm going to save over time, and that's why, and then go for this particular decision. But also, I think the risk is also distributed over time. So if you do end up failing, the expectation that you have from this particular trip that I'm going to to do 2 years out of the future is also less because I can't see that in status quo. I can't control that as per opening government says. This is where the idea that if you go ahead and you fail, the self-doubt becomes immensely problematic. I think your ability to just live with yourself and your ability to determine your self-worth and actualize yourself is based on how much self-doubt you have at that point, right? When expectations increase on short-term goals, because short-term goals are supposed to be maximizing utility as much as possible in the short term, you probably are just placing all your eggs in one basket. So you're probably just putting all those resources that you have just to maximize the amount of utility you get in the shortest amount of time possible. This means the expectation that you want out of the return on investment from this particular kind of investment that you make is also increasing. This means when this decision does fail, the regret or the sadness is also proportionately bad or proportionately negative, primarily because you had so much expectation from this particular thing. When things are uncertain into the future, when you know that as a person things will change over time, my decision process will change over time, my information will be more information will come to me, and that's why my decision making process will be change over time. I think the ability or the expectation you place on this particular decision also reduces. That means if the decision even fails in a worst case scenario on the long term, your ability to go ahead and make peace with it is much better, primarily because you're not as sad as you were on government benches. Why is self-doubt the most important thing in this debate? I think it's very simple. I think what Vansh told you, that your future decision making process are harmed when you have a self-doubt. But secondly, you have, like I said before, you have no way to go ahead and push back against those people who are shaming you for that particular failure, right? That means you have no counter narrative, and if people say that what you did was wrong, then you just buy into it because you know that you acted on your emotion and you acted on things like that gave you immediate catharsis, immediate utility. I want to note this very clearly, and this is the framing of the argument that I just gave. I think human beings are just hardwired to go ahead and make self decisions because they are hardwired to believe in self-preservation and all that. I think when you just want to look out for yourself, short-term goals are largely then based on emotions, and your emotions are generally irrational and they're dynamic in nature. They change with your age, they change over time. That means your rationalizing decision to yourself also becomes incredibly lesser on government side. So that means regret also increases on government as a consequence, right? Secondly, and this is the more important bit, this is where I engage with the metric in this debate of decision making process. I think the biggest harm that exists in this debate is when you go for short-term decisions, you create a tunnel vision that you want to maximize utility out of this particular decision. This means you block out every other thing or the ramifications of the decision that can have on other people. So if I just want to say smoke up because I want that gives me catharsis in the short term, and my parents are religious and they don't want me to go out and smoke up, I think that the issue just simply becomes that you don't look at those ramifications outside this particular maximizing your current utility in the short term. This means when you don't look outside this particular tunnel vision, this just means that your ability to derive support out of other support structures that you will affect as a consequence of you taking short-term decisions also reduces. This means when you are faced with failure, one, you can't rationalize to others or to yourself as to why you led to this particular failure. But secondly, you don't have any support to go ahead and help you get through this particular failure. We need those people in our life. We need our parents. We need those kind of support structures primarily so that we can offset the kind of sadness that you are seeing from this particular failure. I think failure is inevitable in this debate. No side can possibly posit that all decisions will be good or bad if you look at short term or long term. I think just people make decisions. There are other counter narratives that are always at play. Things like religion, things like trends always exist. I think people just make rational decisions both in short term as well as long term. But the ability for you to come to peace with a particular decision is what we'll win this debate on. But before that, go on, I'll take over.
We're much more adaptive with decisions on our side of the house because you go ahead and look at what happens immediately after you make one decision rather than go ahead and look what happens when a long-term plan fails. We think that
cool. So if you place a lot of expectation on a particular decision, primarily because you want to maximize utility out of this decision-making process, and if you fail, I think the ability for you to place expectation on the next decision also reduces because now you're in a constant state of self-doubt. That means you are not starting from t equal to 0, you're largely negative, and all your choices are already negative in a way, or the kind of metric you set is already negative primarily because you're in a state of self-doubt. I think that self-doubt is incredibly bad on your side. That means the next decision you probably take will not be coming from a free state of mind because you are in constant self-doubt. I think this is the problem that exists with governments that they never solve. Just coming to very quickly to CG. I think they say that social movements just happen in short term because people want to bring about change in short term. I don't think this is the Vansh's idea was much more nuanced than this. I think if
if we see the VLM movement and people who literally went ahead and promoted violence or did vandalism, they were acting in short term because they want immediate catharsis out of this particular movement. I think this meant that the movement was villainized against you. The weaponization of this particular emotion and the irrationality behind this emotion means that the people can push back upon you about the short term decisions much worse, and that means you don't even have a defense because one, you can't rationalize it for yourself, but also you have lost support structures. People who are supporting the VLM movement don't support it when they go ahead and do vandalism. I think this just means that on the net, social movements are much worse on the government side, and for all those reasons. See you.
I thank those officers for their fine speech, and I also thank us for engaging the debate. Floor, shake hands.
Done.